A parchment genealogy lies open under candlelight, and the ink does something strange as your eye moves backward through it. Near the center of the page, the names are dense, confident, and imperial. Dukes, kings, emperors. Marriages that bind kingdoms together. Titles that carry weight across Europe. But the farther back the line goes, the less certain it feels. The branches thin out. The handwriting begins to lean on legend. And by the time the family reaches its supposed beginnings, what should look like ancestry starts to look like repair. One of the most powerful bloodlines in European history appears in the record with enormous force, and then, almost immediately, it dissolves into fog. The official explanation is simple enough. The Habsburgs did not suddenly appear in 1400. Historians trace them to the region of present-day Switzerland, to a castle built in the early 11th century, and farther back still to a figure usually identified as Guntram the Rich in the 10th century. By the 13th century they were already a serious noble family in the Upper Rhine world. Then came Rudolf of Habsburg, elected German king in 1273, and the line began its long association with Austria. The standard story is not that the family had no past. It is that their past was medieval, regional, and imperfectly preserved, like so many others. That answer accounts for part of the problem, but not the pattern. Because the question is not whether the Habsburgs existed before 1400. They did. The question is why the bloodline most people recognize, the one that feels solid, continuous, and historically inevitable, seems to arrive fully stabilized only after the dynasty becomes politically indispensable. Before that point, there are counts, castles, territories, and scattered ancestors. After that point, there is a line. A clean one. A useful one. A line that looks as if Europe had been waiting for it. That is where the hidden theory begins. Not with the claim that the Habsburgs were invented out of thin air, and not with the childish idea that all medieval genealogy is false. The serious possibility is narrower and more interesting. The Habsburg bloodline did not suddenly begin after 1400. It suddenly became legible after 1400. What later generations inherited was not simply ancestry preserved from the deep past. It was ancestry organized, hardened, elevated, and politically disciplined for imperial use. The family may be old. The version of the family that history remembers may be much younger. The first clue is the castle itself. Later Habsburg memory encourages the mind to imagine an ancestral fortress already heavy with destiny, as though world rule were visible in the stone from the beginning. But the early seat of the family was not some impossible imperial citadel. It was a regional stronghold built in stages, with timber structures, later additions, and practical defensive features that make perfect sense for a rising noble house and none at all for the myth that would eventually grow around it. The origin is smaller than the legend requires. That matters. Because dynasties always prefer beginnings that resemble endings. The actual beginning of the Habsburgs looks local, contingent, and almost ordinary. The second clue is the dynasty's own uncertainty about its early origins. Once you move backward before Rudolf's rise, the line stops feeling like a clean chain and starts feeling like a field of competing claims. This is not a modern attack on the family. It is built into the historical record itself. Medieval genealogies were never neutral family albums. They were instruments. They existed to prove rights, status, precedence, and legitimacy. If a ruler needed a nobler descent, a chronicler could often help arrange one. That is why noble houses across Europe acquired heroic forefathers, sacred forefathers, Trojan forefathers, Roman forefathers, and biblical forefathers. The Habsburgs were no exception. At different times, lines of descent were built for them that ran through the Trojans, through Roman houses, through the Carolingians, even through sacred antiquity. That is not what a dynasty does when its ancestry is self-evident. That is what a dynasty does when ancestry must be made to perform. And that performance tells you something important. If the early bloodline were already sufficient, Myth would not have to work so hard. Legendary ancestors do not appear because the past is strong. They appear because the past is useful when enlarged. The Habsburgs did not merely inherit memory. They inherited a need. Once the family began moving toward imperial rank, its earlier history had to be made proportionate to its future power. A local comital house could survive with ambiguity. A European dynasty could not. The third clue arrives with Rudolf I. He is often presented as the moment when the Habsburgs step onto the main stage of European history. That is correct, but incomplete. Rudolf did not create the family. He changed the scale at which the family could be seen. Before Rudolf, the Habsburgs were important regionally. After Rudolf, they become a serious contender for dynastic permanence inside the empire. When he was elected German king in 1273 and then secured Austria and Styria for his sons, something fundamental changed. The family gained not only land but a platform. Ancestry now had to carry imperial weight. From this point forward, genealogy was no longer just about remembering fathers and sons. It became the scaffolding of a political future. But the rise was not smooth, and that roughness matters. Later Habsburg history often feels continuous because later Habsburg power made continuity look natural. The earlier reality was messier. There were rival houses, setbacks, lost opportunities, exclusions, struggles for rank, legal maneuvers, symbolic inflation. One of the most revealing details in the early Habsburg story is that the family had to fight for the status it later seems to possess automatically. Titles had to be defended. Claims had to be staged. Even the language of Austrian rank had to be pushed into existence through documents that were less than straightforward. That is not the behavior of a bloodline resting on universally accepted antiquity. It is the behavior of a dynasty still assembling itself. What makes the 14th and 15th centuries so important is not that the Habsburgs suddenly begin to exist there. It is that Europe begins to need them there. Once the family becomes central to imperial politics, its past starts receiving a different kind of attention. The line is cleaned. The branches become more serviceable. The family is no longer just one noble house among many. It becomes a vessel for crowns, inheritances, alliances, and succession strategies that affect the entire continent. That is the moment when ancestry stops being merely retrospective and becomes infrastructure. Bloodline turns into statecraft. There is also a problem of survival. Medieval records are uneven by nature. Charters disappear. Monastic archives burn. Local disputes erase names that once mattered intensely and later not at all. A family can be real and still be poorly illuminated in the surviving record. That part should not be exaggerated into a mystery. But neither should it be used to explain away everything. The unevenness of medieval evidence is ordinary. What is not ordinary is how later dynastic histories transform that unevenness into smooth inevitability. The public does not usually encounter the early Habsburgs as a fog of local counts, uncertain links, and propagandistic claims. It encounters them as the beginning of an empire in embryo. That is a very different thing. The pattern sharpens when you compare bloodline with territory. The Habsburgs did not rise because they had the most elegant ancestry in Europe. They rose because they accumulated position. Marriages, extinctions of rival families, territorial opportunities, and imperial elections changed their reality on the ground. In other words, political success came first, and genealogical brightness followed it. Once the family controlled enough land and enough titles, earlier generations could be reread in the light of later power. Success moved backward through time. A local ancestor became a founder. A scattered inheritance became a dynastic cradle. A castle became the beginning of a world order. This is where maps matter. Look at the early Habsburg sphere before the Austrian turn. It is regional, fragmented, tied to the Upper Rhine and Aargau, close to other noble houses that were stronger, older, or simply more visible at the time. Then look at the later Habsburg world. Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, the imperial title. Then Spain, the Low Countries, and beyond. The spatial jump is enormous. And whenever a family's geographical reality expands that fast, its historical memory must expand with it. Old names that once served local prestige are no longer enough. The dynasty has to look as broad in time as it now looks in space. There is a bureaucratic explanation for much of this, and it is more convincing than any dramatic conspiracy. Archives are built for power, not for innocence. A ruling house preserves the records that secure claims, succession, landholding, precedence, and legitimacy. Historians in service to courts do not merely collect facts. They arrange them into authority. Genealogy becomes a branch of administration. A bloodline is filed the way a border is filed. Useful branches are brightened. Uncertain ones are stabilized or absorbed into narrative. Weakness becomes ambiguity. Ambiguity becomes tradition. Tradition becomes memory. And memory, once repeated enough, becomes history for everyone else. The Habsburgs were especially vulnerable to this process because they became too large to remain provincial in the imagination. Once the family could plausibly claim to sit at the center of European order, its origins could no longer remain a thin Swiss-German problem full of documentary caution. The line had to harden. Not because anyone secretly fabricated the entire dynasty, but because empire requires ancestry equal to empire. A family ruling crowns across Europe could not be left standing on a genealogy that still looked like a local clerical dispute. The pattern repeats in the way later historians talk about them. There is often a smooth movement from origin to destiny, from castle to crown, from count to emperor, as though the line had always been waiting to reveal what it already was. But the record does not naturally read that way. It must be made to read that way. There were dead ends, side branches, rival dynasties, exclusions from power, periods when a Habsburg future was far from guaranteed. The later narrative is not false. It is compressed. And compression is one of the oldest tricks in dynastic memory. If enough time, conflict, and uncertainty are folded into one clean chain, contingency starts to look like inheritance. There is another revealing detail here. The Habsburg ancestral castle itself was eventually outgrown. The family no longer lived at the place that had named it. That fact is small, but it matters. Once a dynasty leaves its point of origin behind, that origin becomes symbolic territory. It can be curated, reinterpreted, elevated. The real life of the dynasty moves elsewhere, in courts, capitals, and marriage negotiations, while the old birthplace is left to carry more meaning than it originally possessed. Stone remains. Narrative accumulates around it. The physical site stays regional. The symbolic site becomes imperial. That is why the title feels true even when taken literally it is not. No ancestry before 1400 does exist in the strict sense. There are names before 1400. There are counts before 1400. There is a castle before 1400. There is even a traceable line, though it comes with caution, uncertainty, and legendary interference. But the Habsburg bloodline, as later Europe learned to see it, the stable, luminous, almost overqualified genealogy of an imperial house, does seem to appear suddenly. Not because the family lacked ancestors. Because the ancestors were not enough until the dynasty became too important to be left with an ordinary medieval past. And that is the unsettling reframing. The Habsburgs did not rise out of nothing. They rose out of the same mixture that produced so many ruling houses: land, war, marriage, extinction of rivals, legal improvisation, symbolic inflation, and selective memory. What makes them different is not that their ancestry is missing. It is that their ancestry was later made to look inevitable. The bloodline did not suddenly begin. It suddenly became usable. What remains, then, is not a blank before 1400, but a warning about how power reorganizes the past. A dynasty can be ancient without being clearly documented. It can be traceable without being coherent. It can be real without yet looking like the thing posterity will later insist it always was. The Habsburgs become visible not only because they survive, but because once they control enough of Europe, the archive itself begins to bend toward them. The record is still there. The local counts. The Swiss origin. The castle. Rudolph's leap. The legal inventions. The later imperial smoothing. None of it has to be invented. It only has to be read in sequence instead of in reverse. Because in reverse, the line looks natural. In sequence, it looks built. And the real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.